Hello, and welcome to the channel. In the previous video I covered the initial stages of the 100 Years' War, the political turbulence in England during the reign of Richard II, and the eventual usurpation by Henry Bolingbroke to become Henry IV in 1399. In this video, before returning to England, I first want to cover what was going on in France during this period. The 100 Years' War had a great impact on France. English raids routinely left the countryside devastated, and the kings of France struggled to maintain a balance of power over their nobles. Unlike England, where the noble title Duke of York did not necessarily entail owning York itself, French titles were fixed to the land they owned, meaning the Duke of Brittany really was the Duke of Brittany, and therefore had a semi-independent territory. When there was a strong king of France, authority could be asserted over these different regions and nobles. However, when a weak king ruled, strife would arise, and in 1392 this is exactly what happened. In that year, Charles VI had gone mad. We're not sure exactly what with, though it was likely schizophrenia, and he began to attack his companions. According to the records, he was known to run about his halls howling like a wolf, and believed he was made of glass and would shatter at any moment. In the medieval age, the king was the highest authority, the arbiter of justice, and the keeper of the peace. With the king unable to rule, a power vacuum emerged for control of the king and the kingdom. It was filled by two of the great magnates of France, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, the king's uncle, and Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's brother. Philip would die in 1404 and pass the role of Duke of Burgundy to his son, John, known as John the Fearless. Both dukes wanted power for their own reasons. Burgundy wished to extend their power across the border with the Holy Roman Empire and into the Low Countries, which today make up Western Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium. Orleans wished to divert income to help secure his claim on Milan across the Alps in Italy, and both were willing to fight for the position of control of the king. Their opposition to each other mostly took the form of political disagreements and the occasional brawl by their supporters, until, on the 23rd of November 1407, John had Louis ambushed and killed on the streets of Paris. John fled to Flanders after admitting to organising the murder, and the Orleanist cause was taken up by the Armagnacs, led by Count Bernard Armagnac, whose daughter had married Louis's son Charles. In 1408, John received a pardon from the king and returned to Paris, but this was only to be the beginning of the conflict between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. England had been dealing with its own civil unrest during this time. Although Henry had come to the throne with much support, there were many who still opposed him, and his taking of the throne in 1399 was used as an opportunity by various lords to settle their own grievances. In 1400 there had even been an attempt to kill Henry and reinstate Richard, today known as the Epiphany Rising. One of these lords looking to settle some scores was Owen Glendower, a Welsh noble who in 1400, over some disputed land, began a rebellion, attempting to reassert Welsh independence since Wales had been occupied at this point for over 100 years. He was initially successful, managing to win many nobles to his side, including the Mortimers, the Earls of March, and the claimants of the throne of England in their own right. He gained another great ally in the Percys. The Percys were one of the great border families of the north, and they had initially supported Henry in usurping Richard. However, by 1403 their relationship with the king had soured. The reason seems to have been a culmination of things. Their request for financial aid from the king went unanswered, and they had been passed over for positions in government and across the country. Not only this, they were also related to the Mortimers through marriage, and when Edmund Mortimer, head of the Mortimer family and uncle to the Earl of March, was captured by Glendower, they appealed to Henry to be able to ransom him back. Henry refused, as having Edmund in prison meant that the claims to the throne by the Mortimers held less sway. This dispute between Henry and the Percys would come to a head in July 1403 at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Henry Percy, called Hotspur and son of the Earl of Northumberland, arrived in Chester and began recruiting a force to lead the rebellion. King Henry, who had assembled an army and begun heading north to aid the Percys on the Scottish border, heard of the rebellion and began to make his way west to meet them. The two forces met at Shrewsbury and fought a bloody battle. The rebels, composed of Cheshire men, some Welsh forces, and Percy retainers, were defeated by the Royalist force, led by King Henry and his commanders, as well as his son, the Prince of Wales, the future Henry V. Although the battle was short, it had been a violent one, and by its end Hotspur was dead and the Prince of Wales, Henry, wounded in the face by an arrow. Thomas Percy, the Earl of Worcester, and uncle to Hotspur, was executed the following day. The battle was decisive, and though rebellions would continue, through Henry's attitude of forgiveness and Prince Henry's successful campaigns in putting down the Welsh rebellions, many would be brought onto the Lancastrian side. By 1409 the Welsh rebellions had fizzled out and Owen Glendower disappeared. Henry IV died on the 20th of March 1413 and was succeeded by his son Prince Henry, who now became King Henry V. Henry's coronation meant a new start for England, as any dispute over Henry IV's legitimacy could be put aside for the new reign. Not only this, Henry was popular with the people. A young warrior king, he had proven himself a capable leader in battle, and he knew exactly where to direct his ambitions. In France, the factional fighting between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians had grown worse, and there had even been some military confrontations. John the Fearless had lost his support in Paris, and had retreated to his lands in Burgundy, whilst the Armagnacs, who had the support of the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, moved to take his place. This divide in France gave the English the perfect opportunity to make their return, and it also gave Henry the opportunity to mend the divisions amongst his own nobility by giving them an exterior foe. It had always been his father's dream to restart the war with France. In fact, it had been one of the major reasons for his usurpation of the throne from Richard, who had sought peace. Under Henry V it could be a reality. He quickly settled matters with Scotland, and foiled the Southampton plot, a conspiracy by some of the English nobility to have the Earl of March made king. In fact, it was March himself who turned the conspirators in when he found out about it. One of those conspirators was Richard of Königsberg, the king's cousin, and the father of the famous Duke of York who would begin the War of the Roses. When both the Armagnacs and the Burgundians appealed to Henry separately for his help against the other, he responded that he would be coming for the crown of France himself. By 1414 he was ready to set sail, and so began making his way for France. The army took with him was some 11,000 strong, and they landed at Harfleur and began to siege. It lasted for more than a month, and although they captured the town, militarily speaking, it had been a disaster. Almost a third of the English army had died of dysentery, and much of the town was now destroyed by English cannon. This would not deter Henry, however, and leaving behind his cannons and baggage, marched his army from Harfleur to Calais. He likely did this to put on a show of strength against the French and prove his power to the French populace. The French had been busy during the siege as well, and had assembled a force much larger than the English, some estimates putting it at around 20,000 men. In its ranks were some of the greatest magnates of the realm, including the Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, Alencon and Brittany. The Dauphin, heir to the French throne, was not allowed to join the army, and it was instead led by Marshal Boucicaut and Constable d'Albret. The French army began trailing the English army, and the two forces met by the small village of Agincourt. The following battle became one of the most famous victories in English history. Rain from the night before had left the battlefield muddy, and when the French cavalry charged they became bogged down in the mud, vulnerable to the English archers. Eventually the two sides came to blows, with sword and polearm, and after a long bloody battle the English were victorious. In one day the French nobility had been decimated, many killed in the fighting and those captured put to death. Although the overall campaign had been largely unsuccessful in making any considerable gains, the English victory at Agincourt invigorated the English mood, and the following years Henry, along with his brothers and the great English commanders, would begin carving out areas of France. His brother John, Duke of Bedford, defeated a French fleet blockading Harfleur, and quickly the English were masters of the Channel once again. In 1417 Henry made an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, and even John, Duke of Burgundy, decided to throw in his lot with Henry, and recognised him as King of France. Instead of the campaign of 1415, this time round Henry led a slow, methodical campaign, taking the regions of France through siege instead of raiding. The Armagnacs were unable to oppose his invasion, as they were sieged in Paris by the Burgundians, who successfully gained control of the capital. By 1419, Henry was in undisputed control of Normandy, and he set up English administration on the duchy. There was little the French could do now to stop him, still divided between Burgundians and Armagnacs. Two Dauphins had already died, and the third, the future Charles VII, was firmly in the Armagnac camp. Even John the Fearless, despite his name, had come to fear the English, and so he tried to reach out to the Armagnacs. The two sides agreed to meet on a bridge over a river to discuss peace and unity. However, the Duke was killed. Hacked to death on the Dauphin's orders, peace between the Burgundians and Armagnacs was shattered for good, and Philip, son of John, now became Duke of Burgundy and joined the English in full. The English, with the Burgundians now on their side, began negotiations with Queen Isabeau for Henry to marry her daughter Catherine, and to disavow her son the Dauphin as a bastard, along with making Henry Charles VI's heir. After marrying Catherine, Henry, along with Philip, continued the war in France. By the 1st of September 1420, Henry and Philip entered Paris and occupied it, an occupation which would last 15 years. In 1421, Henry and Catherine returned to France to celebrate after 3 years of war. The celebrations would not last though, as in April Henry received news of the death of his brother, Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, who had died fighting a French army. This defeat gave new life to the French cause and angered Henry, who quickly returned to France to continue the war. Whilst fighting in France, Henry received news of the birth of his son by Catherine, the future Henry VI, who would be his only child and heir to the throne of England and France. In return, England would receive bad news from France, as Henry had become ill and he died, likely of dysentery, on the 31st of August 1422. With his death, Prince Henry, a boy not a year old, became King of England, and shortly after, with the death of King Charles, King of France as well. Before dying, Henry V made his brother John, Duke of Bedford, Regent of France, and established a council to rule England. Although news of the king's death was a tragedy to the English, they were about to see some of their greatest successes in France under the regency of John, Duke of Bedford, who would lead the English to victory in battle. We'll be covering John's victory and the state of English politics in the next video.